it's fair use. Hare Krishna again. Hello. We were just live, and I was playing this really cool song by Led Zeppelin, and then the streaming went offline again. Well, we got a what's it called? A warning from Facebook, because the algorithm, the algorithm of Facebook discovered that, they discovered the song that I was playing through this. I mean, I wasn't even playing it so it really sucks, because it's kind of spoiled my whole introduction. Maybe we could play just for a second, and maybe anyway, that's enough. And the chorus is, it's nobody's fault but mine. It's nobody's fault but mine. I'm gonna save my soul tonight. It's nobody's fault but mine. Sorry, much worse than Robert Plant, but what to do? We gotta escape the Facebook algorithm. So before I tell you what's the connection between this famous song from Led Zeppelin, it's nobody's fault but mine, and the philosophy of Bhakti Yoga, and in passing, the Jean-Paul Sartre and, existentialism, I want to tell you a quick story about Led Zeppelin and my experience with Robert Plant back in 1999. So back in 1999, I was living as a monk in the Hare Krishna temple in Los Angeles, wearing saffron robes, the whole 9 yards, no girls. I mean, you can look a little bit, but no girls. And, and full absorption in sacred scripture and saving the world. And one of my services my main service was to go to the Los Angeles airport with a group of friends, including a Croatian friend who's still a monk in Los Angeles. And we would sell copies of the Bhagavad Gita to one and anybody. And it was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my entire life. Because to try to give somebody a religious book or a spiritual book, I mean, spirituality, religion, we could talk a lot about the difference. But to give somebody a book about God or about the divine is hard enough. A book about God or the divine coming from a totally different culture than the person is used to, even harder. And on top of that, to ask them money for it, which is what we used to do, was really hard. And on top of that, you add the pressure of Los Angeles airport, which is one of the most passionate, stressful, places on the planet. So anyway, I would go there 5-6 days a week, and one day, who do I see coming? Terminal 1, U.S. Air, very tall, is Robert Plant, the lead singer of Led Zeppelin. And I was like, wow, I got to give him a Bhagavad Gita. So he's walking, and as I see him, he's coming. He's got Johnny Depp. I gave a Bhagavad Gita to Johnny Depp also, but he's walking by with what's the guitarist's name? Jimmy Page. And then like 2 or 3 or 4, like there was a group of about 6 or 7 people around him, and he was wearing like these sort of red Indian meditation beads, and he had this really beautiful Indian woman walking next to him. So I approached him and said, "Excuse me, are you a famous musician?" And he's like, "Yes." And I go, "Well, here." And then I gave him, I told him the same mantra I told everybody, the simple, African American housewife to the Chinese, taxi driver to, Led Zeppelin, or same old thing, because ultimately everybody's a soul. So. Right, we're all souls. So I said, well, this is an ancient wisdom from India, and it shows, that I show them pictures of the Bhagavad Gita. It's about the body reincarnating, and this is a great classic, and blah blah blah, and it's about the soul and reincarnation and God and yoga, meditation, and he.
And you were singing about that in one of your famous songs.
Was he? No, I didn't know the connection. I didn't make the connection yet between his song and the Bhagavad Gita, and so. And you know what I told him, which was crazy? I said, this book is a book that teaches you, that reminds you that fame is temporary. Now, that was the wrong thing to tell Robert Plant, because he was obviously, on the decline after his huge, godlike status in the late 1970s, And so instead of getting offended, he looked at Jimmy Page, they looked at each other, they smiled, and they both looked at me, and Robert Plant said, "Yeah, I think we know that." And then that Indian woman, she saved the day. because he had this Bhagavad Gita, this very edition, and then he looked at her and he said, "Is this a good edition?" And if she had said no, don't buy it, he would have totally followed her. But she said, "Yeah, it's a good one." So he said, "Okay, I'll buy it then." And he had a little like sort of Native American or Guatemala kind of little, stitched little round pouch where he had his money. So he pulled it out of his thing, he opened it up, and he gave me a $20 bill, and he thanked me, and he walked off.
Wow.
So he got Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita. So what's the connection? How do we relate to this song? And what's the connection with Jean-Paul Sartre, which we all know, one of the founders of the existentialism movement in France, which I identified with so much before I became a devotee. I really, I would like, I barely read any books of existentialism, but still, because I wanted to identify as a Frenchman, far from France, living in America, I would say, yeah, I'm an existentialist. I follow Jean-Paul Sartre. So what's the connection between Jean-Paul Sartre, this song, which is called "It's Nobody's Fault But Mine," and the Bhagavad Gita, especially one verse from Krishna in the 13th chapter? Well, the answer is one sentence, and it is this. It is personal accountability. So this little short class is about this, about personal accountability. How we all have to be responsible and take full responsibility for our choices and for the results of our choices. Okay, so let's look at the Led Zeppelin song, the famous saying by Jean-Paul Sartre, and then Krishna's teachings in the 13th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. So this song, we sang it, I sang it, it's nobody's fault but mine. In other words, if I'm suffering right now, if someone is suffering, it's not his or her. I'm just going to say his, okay? But it also applies to her. I don't want to say his or her every time, So I'm just going to say his. If a soul, if an incarnated soul in, let's say, a human body is suffering, whatever he's suffering from, it's not, his government's fault. It's not, his abusive mother or his abusive father's fault. It's not, his ex, whatever, boss's fault. It's not the fault of the guy who tricked him into investing his father's inheritance and losing all his money. It's not the fault of, whatever, the guy on a bicycle who ran into him when he was crossing the street and therefore, was left paralyzed, in his left foot for the rest of his life. It's nobody's fault but that individual person. That individual person's. So that's what he's singing. We may agree, we may not agree. And we'll see what Krishna thinks about it, right? But that statement, it's nobody's fault but mine, says what it says. That it's nobody's fault for my suffering than myself. It also implies it's nobody's fault but mine for my enjoyment also. The flip side of karma. The so-called bad karma has a flip side, which is so-called good karma, or so-called happiness in this material world. And I say so-called because I'll speak about it a little bit if I don't forget. The nature of so-called happiness in this world, we can talk about it. So that's Led Zeppelin. And then, the second line is, I'm going to try to save my soul tonight. It's nobody's fault but mine. Which is kind of cool because Robert Plant brings in an element of spirituality. I'm going to try to save my soul tonight. It's nobody's fault but mine. So in other words, whatever mess I'm in, whether it's like some super like drug, or near overdose or whatever crazy, they're getting a lot of money too. And so, can be that bad, what kind of trouble they're in. But anyway, whatever you can imagine, a great sinful life, and the implications or the reactions that come from a sinful life, Led Zeppelin and Robert Plant is saying, look, it's nobody's fault but mine. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to try to save my soul tonight. Okay, so that's Led Zeppelin. Now, let's go to whatever, early 20th century, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, I guess, in France. And you have, Albert Camus, and you have Jean-Paul Sartre, whose wife was Simone de Beauvoir, who is responsible for being one of the founders of the feminist movement. Jean-Paul Sartre, or she actually, is also quite responsible for having introduced abortion in France, legalized abortion. Great contribution. I mean, look, I don't want to talk about the abortion issue, but I'm not ashamed to say that in an ideal world where there's plenty of education and everything, of course, I'm against the killing of unborn children, and I think most spiritualists would be so as a principle. But let's not get into the topic of abortion. The point is that Jean-Paul Sartre, with all his atheism, because he was an atheist, he said one very interesting thing, which relates to Led Zeppelin and which relates to the 13th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. He said, nous sommes jetés dans ce monde. Nous sommes jetés dans ce monde et nous devons assumer pleinement notre existence et nos choix en ce monde. I'm paraphrasing. Basically, he said, we are, or individuals, persons, I'm not going to say souls because he probably didn't believe in a soul, but persons are literally thrown into this world. People, we, humans, humanity is literally thrown into this world. And therefore, humans must have a duty, have no choice but to assume full responsibility for their existence in this world. In other words, you gotta assume total responsibility for your own choices and your own destiny and your own life down here. Now we could ask Jean-Paul Sartre, well, how did we end up here? And first of all, who are we? Are we really our physical bodies? What is consciousness? Is consciousness really just neurons and protons, and it's just, chemicals, and this, the self is simply a biological machine? It's simply, a really sophisticated biological computer. That's all that we are. Right? We could challenge him on that. And then we could say, regardless of whether we are the body or we're the soul or we are the body and we have a soul, how did we get here? Why are we here? Is it just, a big bang and the, random evolutionary theory of evolution to a sophisticated form of life until the Homo sapien, and that's just a complete accident? Okay, that's another discussion. But this point of we have been thrown into this world and therefore we have to assume full responsibility for our life, that theme not only is, echoes what Led Zeppelin, what Robert Plant sang maybe 30 years later, but more importantly for us who appreciate and who follow, the Vedic literatures, that concept totally is in line with the 13th chapter, verse 21 of the Bhagavad Gita. And so I'd like to read this to you in Sanskrit, especially the one line of it, and then I'll read it to you in Croatian. Joj mene, Isuse Bože. So, the verse in Croatian and in Sanskrit goes like this. Karya karana kartritve hetur prakritir uchyate. And here's the important line. Purusha sukha dukkhanam bhoktritve hetur uchyate. Purusha sukha dukhanam. Kaže, you want to read it? Kaže se da, hey, Sundarananda can read it to you.
This verse.
Yeah.
Kaže se da je priroda uzrok svih materijalnih uzroka i posljedica, dok je živo biće uzrok raznih patnji i užitaka u ovom svijetu.
Razumnje. Is that how you say? Razumnje? Razumnješ. So what I want to focus on specifically is this third line. Purusha sukha dukhanam bhoktritve heturuchyate. See, Krishna, God in this verse, is stating something really interesting. He's saying that, he's speaking about what is the cause of this or that, right? And when it comes to the experience that an individual person has in this world, whether it's sukha or dukkha. Sukha means happiness, dukkha means unhappiness. The Bhagavad Gita clearly establishes this super profound concept that it's nobody's fault but mine. In other words, and that, we have to take full responsibility in this world. In other words, the individual soul alone is the cause of the experience of happiness or unhappiness. Purusha in Sanskrit means a controller or a soul, who's trying to be a controller in this world, right? Enjoyer. Yeah, enjoyer. Sorry. Purusha means enjoyer. And the Param Purusha, the supreme enjoyer, is God. And we as souls are small enjoyers. And by definition, at least according to the Bhagavad Gita, each soul actually enjoys by giving love and pleasure to the only real enjoyer, who is God. So, but the soul is sometimes described as the enjoyer with a small e, not as God, but as a small enjoyer. So, Purusha, Sukha means happiness, and Dukkha means unhappiness, distress, sorrow. Purusha Sukha Dukkhanam Bhoktirtver Heturuchyate. That person, that soul alone, is responsible for that experience. So what does that mean? I mean, the implications are profound. From the, let's say, quote unquote, and I say quote unquote because when we speak about good karma or bad karma, a more mature understanding, according to the Vedic literature, is that any karma is problematic. Any karma is kind of bad karma, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But to stay on course with this point, the Bhagavad Gita basically says that if a soul in this world experiences, for example, okay? Because, you could say, well, if you have a lot of money, you can still be unhappy. It's true. But money generally is a symptom of some sort of material happiness, or, having a beautiful relationship, a really nice husband or a very nice wife, or having really good health, let's say, or having, a lot of a great reputation, or having great education, or things like that are generally speaking symptoms of or what could be called good karma. Of course, you could be super rich and then also have some really bad karma, and be always like suffering. Like that's why you have, for example, big superstars, who have everything you think, but they still commit suicide, right? But assuming, let's not take these sort of extreme dichotomous examples. The point is, whatever happiness a person is experiencing in this world, that person, that soul, is responsible for having created that experience. That's the principle that the Bhagavad Gita teaches. And similarly, whatever sorrow, whatever suffering a soul, an incarnated soul, is experiencing in this world, the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, teaches us that that soul is the cause of that soul's experience of unhappiness. That's why a little bit later, I'm going to talk a little bit about this famous saying, don't be angry with the instrument of your karma. Such a profound statement. Don't be angry with the instrument of your karma. So, let's just use some examples, and I'll I'll start with myself as an example. Because it's close to my heart. Last summer, I got robbed by a North African drunk immigrant in the middle of a park on a Sunday morning in Berlin. I had a somewhat expensive necklace. He ripped it off my neck, and as I was running after him, which I shouldn't have, because he could have turned around and stabbed me or killed me, who knows. But anyway, as I was running after him, I slipped and I almost tore my Achilles tendon. And for 2 months I was walking with crutches and it was really painful. And my immediate, and he disappeared. He was able to get away. So my initial reaction was like, I wanted to kill the guy. I was so angry with him, But then when I calmed down a little bit and tried to look at what had just happened to me philosophically, based on Bhagavad Gita 13:21 that I just read, I remembered, the soul alone is responsible for the experience of happiness or distress. So technically speaking, and of course I'm going to speak about what is our duty, do we let ourselves be abused by others, for example, or do we just kind of not use our free will to try our best as often as possible to be as intelligent in this world and avoid precisely abusive situations or suffering situations, It's not a fatalist kind of philosophy where you just kind of switch off your ability to make decisions today for the future and, be responsible. It's not that. But when things they come, for example, all of a sudden, or things happen and you just can't control them. Again, how you react is important. In other words, you're not going to put your head in the head of a lion, for example. Okay, but we can't forget this principle that God tells us in the Bhagavad Gita, that the soul is responsible for the experience. So that guy, that drunkard, smelly, duplicitous, because he was lying trying to be really friendly with me, and then all of a sudden when I wasn't looking, he ripped my necklace off and ran off. Technically speaking, he was, at that point, according to the Bhagavad Gita 13:21, really just an instrument of my own karma. In other words, I believe, according to this verse of the Gita, that I must have stolen his or somebody else's necklace or caused the similar type of experience of frustration, anger, sadness that I was experiencing at that very moment to him or to somebody else in this life or in a previous incarnation. And now, payback time. What goes around comes around. That's another song we could quote from, what's his name? What goes around, comes around, goes around, comes around, it's gonna come around. Anyway, famous singer. Lenny Kravitz also wrote that song a long time in the late 1980s. It's interesting how, elements of Vedic philosophy are slowly seeping into popular culture, I really find that fascinating. So, what do you do? Well, when something really good happens to you, you kind of, thank God and say that, okay, actually, technically speaking, I'm reaping right now the quote-unquote, and again, if I don't forget, I'll get into the why quote-unquote, the good reactions of what I did in the past. I must have done some pious activity, because, the principle is you do good activity, you get material happiness. And you do harm to others, you get suffering, right? And again, the principle is that nobody else is responsible except the individual soul. So before speaking about what you can do, and I want to also quote a very, very wonderful verse from the Bhagavatam, which you can actually use as a daily meditation to help you get through this life in a way that you don't, flip out as much as you would if you didn't have that verse. It's a wonderful technology, literally, that you could use on a daily basis. But before I go into that, let me make a little parenthesis, echoing the words of one great teacher in the Vaishnava tradition, whose name was Bhakti Thakur, who was a very liberal, non-sectarian teacher who was, a very revolutionary kind of teacher in the Gaudiya tradition, because he was one of the first ones to appreciate what he considered to be the wonderful elements in Christianity, for example, and he called, Jesus the Western Savior, And I mentioned that because he did make a certain critique of Christianity, which I'd like to echo here. And I do agree, because I've spoken about this to some Christian theologians who kind of say, well, it's a little bit oversimplified, what I'm going to say, echoing the words of this great teacher, Bhakti Thakur. But there is some relevance in it. And it is this. And may I be forgiven for oversimplifying it. But grosso modo, in Christian theology, you do have the idea, it's kind of mainstream and it's kind of accepted, that humanity is suffering because Adam and Eve bit the apple. Right? Yeah. I mean, humanity has fallen, literally.
It symbolized the first sin.
Yeah.
That means
the original sin.
I'm enjoying not the God.
Right, exactly. But what's really interesting in this notion of original sin, the original sin was committed by somebody else, namely Adam and Eve. And because of Adam and Eve's, falling into temptation, not following the order of God, and, eating that apple, everybody following Adam and Eve later on who didn't eat the apple, at least, in the Bible, there's really only, the Bible doesn't say that every human ate the apple. It says that Adam and Eve ate the apple, and as a result of Adam and Eve's eating the apple, all of humanity became fallen. Right? So,
or prone to sin.
Prone to sinful life? Okay, that's more subtle. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, this great teacher, quoting or making reference to this verse of 13th chapter, verse 21 of the Gita, would say, you see, it's not Adam and Eve's fault that you're suffering. You are suffering because you sinned. Again, the soul alone is responsible for the experience of happiness and distress. Prabhupada, the founder of ISKCON, would often use the example, which I like, that, you can't go to court and say, well, and put the blame on your father. Like, let's say you kill somebody and you go to jail or you go to court and you say, well, look, I know, but actually, why don't you put the blame on my father? Let my father or let my mother or let my older brother go to jail. Let him suffer for my sins, right? So I find that really interesting, that among all the glorification and appreciation that Bhaktivinoda Thakur expressed towards Christian theology, he had one, little bit of a critique on this point of individual responsibility and individual accountability. Right? So, remember I told you about this verse from the Bhagavatam that I think is a great tool that you can use in your life, so you can basically live this life in remembrance of this. Because when you get heated especially with the unhappiness, when good things happen, quote unquote good things happen, you get a lot of money, you get a great relationship, it's easy to thank God, it's easy to to roll with it, and but when things get hard, when you get disappointments, when you get tragedies, then when it's really hard not to get upset and all that. So here's this verse. This verse is a super wonderful verse. It's a verse that you can recite to yourself daily. And it comes from the prayers of Lord Brahma, that chapter that we spoke of last week in the 10th canto of the Bhagavatam. And it goes like this. Tatenu kampam susamikshamano bunjana evatma kritam vipakam ritvagva purbir vidadan namaste jivetayo mukti pade sadayavak. So this great demiurge of the universe, this mini creator of the whole universe, the first created being according to Vedic cosmology, he prays to God and he says, my dear Lord, one who I'll tell you the translation in one shot and then I'll break it down. My dear Lord, one who earnestly waits for you to bestow your causeless mercy upon him, all the while patiently suffering the reactions to his past misdeeds and offering you respectful obeisances with his heart, body, and words, inherits the kingdom of God because it has become his rightful claim. So, my dear Lord, you pray to God, my dear Lord, one who, and you're basically, reminding yourself, like, this could be me, it should be me. One who earnestly waits. Earnestly means it's a combination of eagerness and patience. Like, earnestly means a lot of, determination and honesty. One who earnestly waits for you to bestow your causeless mercy. So you can pray like this, while I wait for you, my Lord, to give me your mercy, which is causeless, which I really don't deserve, or in other words, I deserve much less than what you're willing and what you're going to give me. And all the while, while I wait patiently, and earnestly for you to give me your mercy, I agree to suffer patiently the reactions of my own past sins. So here you see the connection with 13:21 of Bhagavad Gita. The soul alone is responsible. So it's like you take responsibility, like Jean-Paul Sartre says, or like Robert Plant says. You take responsibility. It's not this person's fault. It's not that person's fault. It's my own fault. And whatever suffering I'm experiencing right now, I brought onto myself because I gave the exact same amount of suffering to some other soul in the past. And therefore, instead of complaining, I'm going to rather patiently tolerate, waiting for the Lord's mercy. And I'm going to continue glorifying you, my Lord, with my body. That means, like, literally, I'm going to use my body to go to the church or go to the temple or to go and give Bibles or Bhagavad Gita to people or to give spiritual food to people. I'm going to use my body in your service, my Lord. My heart, I'm going to give my love, all the love of my heart to you, my Lord, and my words. I'm going to speak. I'm going to try to speak about you as much as possible and chant your name as much as possible. If I can have that attitude, you pray to the Lord. Then, Brahma says, you are guaranteed the inheritance of God. In Croatia, as in France, no matter what you do in life, when your dad dies, according to law, you're supposed to get the inheritance of your father. Right?
Yeah. First your mother, then...
Yeah. Whoever's left in the marriage, if the mother is alive, she gets...
Yeah, you get immediately share.
Right, you get a share. That's what happened with me. When my father passed away, his wife got 50% and his 4 biological sons got 12.5%, which sucked because, I'm sorry, but she had 2 children from a previous marriage and she died a few years later, which means her children, which had no biological connection to our father, got twice as much money from our biological father than the 4 of us biological sons, because there were 2 and they got everything from their mom, 50-50, which is 25%. Anyway, sorry. So according to this verse, you inherit automatically, according to law, the inheritance of your father or your mother. So similarly, Lord Brahma says, and that's how you can pray. That my Lord, if I can just continue waiting for your mercy and all the while patiently suffering the reactions to nobody else's misdeed. It's not Adam and Eve's fault. It wasn't my, abusive father's fault. It's not, the guy who stole my money. It's nobody's fault but mine. Like whatever suffering I'm experiencing right now, it's my own fault. I brought it onto myself in a past life or in this very life. And therefore, I'm going to patiently live and not be angry with the instrument of my karma. That's such a cool, powerful state. I mean, if you say this to yourself on a daily basis, I will not get angry with the instrument of my karma. Wow. Because you see things in perspective. And it's sobering. It's sobering in the sense, sobering like when you stop drinking, you become sober, you become serious. It's a very sobering philosophy. In some sense, the implications are, even devotees of God who believe this philosophy are kind of ashamed to speak about it. Because you apply it to a larger, for example, a mass tragedy, right? You apply it to a tragedy that, kills like a large amount of people, for example, in one shot. What's the conclusion according to the philosophy of 1321? Right? Now, to balance what I just said, with what I just said, you also have a responsibility, according to the Vedic literatures, to accept and reject in your life what is always the most favorable, the best, what makes your goal of life, which ultimately is God realization, as easily and as best obtainable as possible. So obviously, to be in a toxic relationship, for example, where you're getting abused by a spouse, like not, really abused, for example, Now, one side of the coin is that, maybe you abused that same person in a past life, or you abused someone else as you're getting abused. But you also have to use your intelligence to resolve that, to get out of that toxic relationship, because it's hurting your spiritual life. It's hurting your life in general, you see. And if you are in a position of where you have dependence, let's say you're a father and you have children, or you're a mother, you have children, or you're a husband and you have a responsibility to take care of your family, or whatever, you're a president or you're a king, or you have dependence, then it's also your responsibility, your sacred responsibility, to assist your dependents in such a way that they also have the most favorable passage towards spiritual realization, right? And I'm saying this because you can get accused of being a fatalist with this type of philosophy. It's just you believe in karma, so it's fatalism. No, you should remember that. I love this analogy. The Mahabharata, which is the greater text in which the Bhagavad Gita enters, gives this wonderful analogy of a chariot. And this chariot has two wheels, and these two wheels are dependent on each other. They're literally connected to each other. One wheel is karma or destiny, and the other wheel is free will. The other wheel is free will. Will. It's free will. And these two wheels of karma and free will are together. They work together. It's not one or the other. One extreme that you can fall into is to think, I am not controlled at all by any type of so-called karma, of predestination. I'm completely free to do anything I want. I mean, that's madness. How can you even think that? You're forced to grow old and die. How can you say you're totally free, Just desire it enough and it's going to manifest, That's one extreme. And the Bhagavad Gita, God in the Bhagavad Gita criticizes this attitude by saying, right, this verse, what is it? Prakriti kriyamanani gunai karmani sarvasha ahankara vimuratma kartaham iti manyate. God in the Bhagavad Gita makes fun of such an attitude by saying the conditioned soul, bewildered by ego, by false ego, thinks himself the doer of activities. I am the doer. I am 100% in control of my life. But these activities are actually being controlled and done by the three modes, the three gunas, the three modes of material nature and karma. So that's one extreme. The other extreme is to say, I have no free will at all, and I'm just, like being taken by the stream of time, and I've got no free will. And that extreme also falls into what we call Mayavad philosophy, where we're all one, we're all God, and everything is one, and therefore there is no individual responsibility, there's no individual volition, there's no free will, because we're all one, right? So that's the other extreme not to fall into. The healthy middle road, the golden middle road, is to remember that, hey, you are a soul, and yes, you are experiencing happiness and distress, which is directly related to happiness and distress that you caused and nobody else caused to some other souls in a past life. But at the same time, you have free will, and how you react and what are the decisions you take now for the future are very much in your control. And so if you live a life like that, reminding yourself, and I'm talking to myself, I'm preaching to myself first, reminding yourself to not get angry at the instruments of your karma, to be grateful when good things happen to you, to acknowledge, it might be from a good thing I did in the past, but ultimately it was sanctioned by God, so ultimately all thanks should go to God. You see this, when Rakitic or when Markic, what was it, all these famous football players or basketball players, a lot of them are very devout Christians, and when they score, immediately, they point to the sky, or they make a sign of the cross, because they want to say, it's not me. It's not me. The glory belongs to God. Like, I was just an instrument. He empowered me. It's all by God's grace that I scored this goal. That's beautiful. So when you have an attitude like that, then you could basically sail through the ups and downs of material life more easily, more steadily, and more centered on God consciousness. And ultimately, as a result, be more happy. Anybody have any question in the live streaming here, or among the live souls in front of me who are kindly tolerating my class? Okay, well then, to conclude, I just want repeat the same thing. We're lucky to have this wonderful knowledge. We're lucky to believe, and we should have. We should take, when we look at our, let's say, at Christians who have so much faith in some cases, in spite of not believing in karma and reincarnation. Like, some tragedy will happen in some Christian's life, for example, and they're not gonna get into the gear of like, well, tatenu kampam tusimi krimano, it's my, I created this to somebody else, because there is no past life in most Christian belief. You have this one lifetime, so how can you, it's just out of the question to believe that you created this life, that we created some pain to somebody else in a past life, and that's why we're experiencing pain right now. And yet, in spite, that's what's amazing, what amazes me, which it should amaze us, that you see that in spite of lacking this theological framework, which gives a wonderful explanation to the question of evil, to why suffering happens. Well, tough luck, buddy, it's nobody's fault but mine. In spite of having that, still, that doesn't stop them from doing what Brahma says, that I'm going to continue glorifying you with my word, my mouth, and my heart. Right? So what to speak of us? What to speak of us who have access, first of all, to this amazing concept, and who believe in it, and if it's true, wonderful. It should give us all the more motivation not to lament, or to lament much less, not to get angry, or to get angry much less, and to not be scratching our head like, why God, why? No, the Bhagavatam explains why. It's very clear why. So we have all the more reason to have faith and devotion to God with this philosophy. Your question?
No, I just want to comment.
Final comment.
I don't think that we should always be like thankful for the pain, I'm so miserable, I don't think that's always the answer, Sometimes we have to say, okay, I made a mistake, but sometimes, you have to act differently, you have to stand up for yourself.
Very good point. Very good point. And that's why I kind of talked about that, the free will. We have to make decisions. We have to be optimistic. In the 12th canto or the 11th canto, God talks about, he says, my devotees should, even when they, have fall downs or when they should remain happy, should remain happy. So that's a good point. However, we are in a world of suffering and things happen, tragedies do happen, and that's unavoidable because we happen to be here. And so in those cases, in those moments, we can take shelter. Instead of going into despair mode, like why, I don't understand, we can go into that, Krishna conscious theology mode.
Mostly when that happens, I go to panic, not despair, but
panic, despair, yeah.
The body reacts, you're
Right.
tense, you're high vibrations, they're not controlled.
Right.
They're unhealthy, for the environment, not only for you.
Right.
So,
And we can always take shelter of the holy name. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hvala, thank you.